And on the New South Wales government, well done to Gladys Berejiklian, who momentarily has removed her alarmist coronavirus mantle and said the Sydney Harbour New Year's Eve fireworks will go ahead and the New South Wales government is willing to pay for the display itself. But, of course, they can't announce anything without telling us how we'll be trapped in all manner of regulations over a virus in which 99% of the cases are mild. But the alarmists keep telling us, don't worry, the cases are up in Europe, the second wave. They don't tell you, do they, that deaths are down. You see, alarmism and fear beat good news apparently all the time. The answer being proffered for the low death rate is simply called herd immunity. Many people already have some immunity to the virus. But to the very serious matters of this week, the first is what I raised earlier but has received no attention. So let me repeat from the Australian Government's Department of Health, September 15, 2020, a week and a bit ago. Quote, the reliability of COVID-19 tests is uncertain due to the limited evidence base. And then further on the same day, quote, there is limited evidence available to assess the accuracy and clinical utility of available COVID-19 tests. May I ask respectfully, why aren't we told this? And why aren't we told that the Centre for Disease Control in America, their major regulatory authority, has this week announced that supposed COVID deaths have been grossly exaggerated? In one sample, 410 of the 422 COVID deaths had comorbidities, many serious, including terminal cancer. And many of the supposed COVID deaths were not even tested for COVID, but just had COVID-like symptoms. They were suspected of having COVID. Yes, we do need a national truth campaign. But I want to put it to you tonight that there are wider issues at stake. I would assert more long-lasting than coronavirus. For example, this week the Premier of Victoria tried to introduce legislation which would have locked up anyone so long as there was, quote, a reasonable suspicion. Such a person might be likely to fail quarantine rules. Who would do the locking up? Designated authorised officers, designated, of course, by the Andrews government. The legislation would have given power to remove children from their parents, transforming Victoria into beyond a police state. As Catherine McGregor said, and I quote, into a pallid version of East Germany. In other words, shut down the citizenry under the guise of shutting down a virus, violate every principle of freedom for which our men and women died at war. Will someone ask Andrews whose idea this was? Who advised the Premier to turn citizen against citizen? But most disturbingly, why has the national government in Canberra been silent? And this merely confirms what Donald Trump argued a week ago at a conference on US history at the Washington National Archives, when President Trump said, quote, whether it's the mob on the street or the cancel culture in the boardroom, the goal is the same: to silence dissent, to scare you out of speaking the truth, and to bully Americans into abandoning their values, their heritage and their way of life, unquote. Well, I venture to say that there are politicians in all parliaments, to say nothing of teachers in classrooms and lecturers in universities, who couldn't define what our values are. Yet I notice talk of a new citizenship test from November 15. We'll ask questions about Australian values and prospective citizens have got to answer them correctly to pass. It all sounds very good, but without boring you with the questions, they come nowhere near identifying the kind of values which we should hold dear but don't. For example, do we honour freedom of speech? Or does the left seek to intimidate and silence? Do we honour freedom of worship? Ask Israel Folau. Are we about equality of opportunity, or do we preach equality of outcomes? Is education a virtue in itself in order to learn the best of our past so that we can better navigate our future? If so, why are our educational achievements by world standards getting worse and worse? But if we're talking Australian citizenship, emphasis on Australian, how is it that in the last census 4.9 million Australians reported speaking a language other than English at home? According to national statistics, 18.2% of Australians are non-English speakers. How on earth do we assimilate, integrate and understand Australian values if we can't speak English? Surely instead of all the flowery questions to become an Australian citizen, which I would assert take us nowhere, shouldn't we begin by asking one simple question, which is really a statement and then a question, and say to the person entering Australia, hey, here's a copy of today's edition of the Australian newspaper. Could you please read to me the first paragraph? If you can't, come back when you can. Surely if you can't speak English, how do you understand what's expected of you? And if we can't articulate values, or if they're not taught or reinforced, even simple Christian values, do unto others, etc., is that why you get this week an allegedly Christian school like the Sydney Church of England Grammar School, or commonly called Shaw, producing young men who think a muck-up day entitles them, and I'm not opposed to muck-up days, entitles them to plan to spit on homeless people, assault strangers and kiss underage girls, all spelt out in a document. They were going to meet last night at Waverton Park, and they'd break up into small groups. 5 or 6 had to drink a carton of beer in 15 minutes. Then they'd break off to complete so-called tasks, like break into Taronga Zoo, defecate on a train, hit passing men on their genitalia, get points for having sex with a woman over 80 kgs, or an unattractive woman rated 3 out of 10. And the response by the school was not from the headmaster, but through a PR outfit. Quote, consequences for any boys that do participate will be severe and could include the loss of their place at the school. Could include? My point is, if Australia's system of values is embodied in the behaviour of Daniel Andrews and other political leaders who grossly suppress fundamental freedoms, perhaps our young are rebelling by this appalling behaviour. After all, from whom do they take their lead? Could it be a billionaire like Michael Bloomberg? In America, convicted criminals can't vote. Bloomberg's a billionaire. He's reportedly raised more than $22 million to pay the fines for 32,000 felons in Florida so that they can vote against Donald Trump. Pay off the fines and their voting rights are restored in the critical battleground state of Florida. The law says that people with past felony convictions must pay court fines and fees before they're able to vote. There's talk now of the potential of a bribery investigation to be launched against Bloomberg. What do you get when you put the behaviour of Daniel Andrews, our freedom-depriving politicians, young men from a private school and a billionaire like Bloomberg? What do you get when you put all that together? I would suggest you arrive at the certain truth that nothing much matters anymore. The rules are there to be broken. If our very constitution can be ignored, undermined and not defended, we can't be too far away from the law of the jungle, where the biggest, the fittest and the richest survive. And when we arrive at that point, democracy and its hard-won values are very much on the rack. But then we're most probably mugs to believe that democracy gives us any rights at all. As Mark Twain said, if voting made any difference, they wouldn't let us do it.